the skin economy has just been shattered, and I promise this is going to make sense. Now, unlike in Elden Ring, our shattering isn't going to turn everyone into an undead husk, but it has quite literally broken down the entire order of how the skins market worked, causing widespread chaos, and inevitably, it is going to force a new order to be created. And in this video, I'm going to explain how and why the market has gotten so broken, and what this means for the future of skins. This is a bizarre analogy, but again, it's going to make sense. Let's get into things. So I'm going to start off by talking about something that I totally haven't spent the last 4 years talking to death. Chinese Counter-Strike. Now, to give a brief and very oversimplified history of Chinese Counter-Strike and skins, Counter-Strike was released officially in China in 2017. It really started to take off in 2019, and all of a sudden everyone's skins started getting really expensive, and the culprit wasn't hard to figure out. But while the Chinese Counter-Strike community was busy pumping crazy amounts of money into the game, something very interesting was happening in the background. You see, the Chinese government has what we're gonna call special rules when it comes to things like video games and money. And because of these rules, Chinese CS players have to use a special version of the game that has limited features, and they also can't use a lot of Western skins marketplaces, and there's a lot of limits on their ability to buy stuff from outside of China in general. And while these restrictions can be worked around, like you can use VPNs, you can use crypto, you can do a bunch of different things, if you make something enough of a pain, most people won't bother with it. And for the majority of Chinese CS players, buying skins from outside of China is too much of a pain to bother with, so they stick to Chinese-only marketplaces. But for the same reasons that Chinese players can't access marketplaces in the rest of the world, people in the rest of the world generally can't access Chinese marketplaces, and even if they can, they definitely can't withdraw money from them, which is the main point of having a marketplace in the first place. And this created a situation where there were two separate markets for skins that were only loosely connected. There was some flow between them, but they were still largely separate, which is a recipe for some totally wild shit. And during the first couple of years of CSGO's rise in China, there absolutely was some totally wild shit. Prices for skins could be radically different between the two markets, and if you could access both markets, well, that's an opportunity for you. But this would all come to an end when a marketplace rose that filled the gap, and that marketplace was called Buff163. So what makes Buff163 special? Well, the first thing that made it special is that it managed to get an iron stranglehold over the Chinese market. How it did this, I'm not sure, but the results are pretty clear. Buff163 quickly became the largest skins market in existence. It wasn't even close. And having gotten this insane level of dominance over the Chinese market, they proceeded to open up their site to non-Chinese users. So long as you had a mobile phone, you were able to use Buff. And given Buff had the entire Chinese scene behind it, it was much easier to sell skins there than literally any other marketplace in existence. And while non-Chinese users couldn't cash out their balance, there was a bit of a loophole. Users were completely free to sell their balance to each other. Buff could have stopped this, but instead they actively helped it. They let people ask support to transfer the balance from one account to another. The buyer would then send the seller cash for the balance separately, and the end result was basically that Buff had a de facto cash out system for non-Chinese users. Now, this system still wasn't very convenient to casual players. Your average CS player outside of China wasn't using Buff, but basically the entire trading community was, and this linked the Chinese market with the rest of the world, and it allowed Buff163 to set prices of all skins across the entire market. Do you think your StatTrak Sapphire is pretty cool? Too bad, the Chinese hate them. They're worth less now. As a result, the entire skins market, as we know it today, basically revolves around Buff163. Buff163, in a very literal sense, is the market. However, there was a bit of a problem. What Buff163 was doing probably wasn't legal in China, and that brings us on to the next topic, the shattering. So the problem Buff had is that it basically provided a kind of backdoor for Chinese people to move money out of China, beyond the control of the benevolent iron fist of the Chinese Communist Party. And why does that matter? Well, the CCP actually puts a lot of limits on the ability of its citizens to move money out of China, which is very different to most countries. And Buff happened to be providing this backdoor in the middle of a massive crackdown on video games and tech companies by the CCP. And did I mention Buff is owned by NetEase, one of the massive tech companies being cracked down on? But it did have one thing going for it. By the standards of video games in China, Counter-Strike is really small, so small that it could avoid attention simply by not being noticed. And for a long time, it appears that it did just that. But eventually, the regulations caught up to them. The first sign of trouble was actually years ago, when Buff blocked people from the USA from registering on the site. This was easily bypassed with an emulator, but it was the first sign that the market was not insulated from the various geopolitical dramas that were happening. Additionally, it seemed like over time the site was getting stricter and stricter on balance transfers. Support tickets to transfer balance started being denied, and accounts doing erratic sales started getting banned. We don't really have detailed information, unfortunately, but from what I can tell, it was mostly Chinese accounts that were being targeted. However, the end would come, and it would come suddenly, in May 2024. First of all, Buff abruptly banned cases from being sold on their site. This came as quite a shock. Most people assumed it was a sign that China was about to crack down on loot boxes. Some people even thought it was a sign cases were about to be removed altogether for some reason. And while there was no official explanation given for it, privately the site said that they chose to do it, they weren't forced. What would cause them to choose to do it though? Well, I'm gonna guess it's probably because they were worried about some kind of government crackdown. Now, this caused quite a bit of chaos on the market. Case prices actually crashed on Steam as a lot of people, particularly bot farmers, started selling their cases there rather than Buff. But this would pale in comparison to what happened next, because on the 24th of March 2024, Buff completely banned non-Chinese users from selling on their site. And with that, its 5-year reign of total dominance over the market abruptly came to an end. Now, there's definitely been some doomerism about this change, and one of the reasons I took my time explaining the context is that I wanted to make it clear why this has happened. There was always a risk non-Chinese users would get banned off Buff, because what Buff was doing broke Chinese law. We had a good run, but eventually it ended up happening. But this change is still a massive deal, because it shatters the entire skin economy. China and the rest of the world are mostly disconnected again. And how are things going to function when the economy has been largely split in two? Even with Buff, there were already disparities. I know people who made hundreds of thousands of dollars buying stuff off Buff and then reselling it on Western marketplaces. And if that was possible with Buff, well, what's going to happen now that there isn't a bridge between the two communities? For example, China has enormously inflated the price of high-tier skins. What's going to happen to their prices in the rest of the world if they cut off from the Chinese market? If a particular skin or sticker suddenly becomes popular in China for whatever reason, well, users from outside of China aren't going to be able to feed that demand, and that is a recipe for some crazy price differences. And not only that, it's just broken trading, because traders use Buff for everything, buying, selling, and most importantly, for pricing stuff. But if prices between China and the rest of the world stop being the same, well, how the fuck are people going to price things now? The rest of the world doesn't have one central marketplace that dominates everything, or that has the kind of volume needed to reliably price stuff. And this is why I call it a shattering, because the old order of things has kind of been shattered. The skins market will never work the same again, and there is a massive question mark over what the skin economy is going to look like a year from now without Buff being the center of the market anymore. Will another skins marketplace manage to dominate the market enough to take its place? Are we going to be stuck with a new chaotic market where no one is sure how to price things anymore and everything is a mess? Or will the old order somehow be restored? We simply don't know, but we are definitely in uncharted territory, and once we finally do get some new releases with nice new skins, it's gonna be really interesting to see what the market does. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this video. If you've enjoyed it, please like, comment, and subscribe. Otherwise, trust the numbers, not your guts. I'm Heyzeus. Thanks for watching, see ya.